All right. Hello, everyone. So Jillian is delayed, so I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker today, Karina Vold. Karina is a philosopher of cognitive science, technology, and artificial intelligence, and an assistant professor at the Institute for the History and Philosophy of Science and Technology here at U of T, and a Schwartz Reisman Fellow for this year. Her current projects include researching the effects of AI on human cognition and autonomy, understanding the harms arising from targeted online nudging, evaluating arguments for existential threats from AI, and building frameworks for the ethical design of AI systems. So with no further ado, I turn things over to you, Karina.
Well, thank you. Thanks so much for having me. So I'm now going to try to share my screen. Okay, great. Well, yes, so thank you for having me. Thank you for the introduction, Benjamin. And thanks to all of you for the opportunity to share some of my work. I've really enjoyed seeing so much of your guys' work over the term. So it's great to kind of get to be a part of these conversations with all of you. So I've published some of what I'll talk about today already in a couple papers with my co-author, Professor José Hernández-Orallo, who I've listed here and is one of my colleagues at the Leverhulme Center for the Future of Intelligence at Cambridge. And I'm going to talk about what we call AI extenders, or the ethical implications of cognitive extension with AI. And if you're not familiar with some of those terms, hopefully I can explain those as I go along. Okay. So I've broken this talk down into 4 parts, and I'll start with the question that kind of started me off on this project, which was how does AI, or how is AI affecting our cognition as humans? And second, I'll give a quick introduction to the extended mind hypothesis, since I wasn't sure if everyone would be familiar with it. And then third, I'll explain how AI could be used to extend cognition. And then finally, with time permitting, I'll end by touching on some of the benefits and challenges of this approach. So how does AI affect our cognition as humans? I wanted to walk you through this little schema that Jose and I came up with as a way of hopefully giving you a kind of overview of how I see cognitive extension fitting into current discussions around AI. So the first thing to note is that AI is notoriously difficult to define, but in most definitions, there's an explicit requirement that a system should operate with a significant degree of autonomy. And the idea here is that the task, or the system, should solve tasks independently with limited or no human assistance or manipulation. So the term autonomous agency was introduced to represent this goal, and it is kind of an implicit in most definitions, but explicit in some. So like the classic definition from Stuart Russell and Peter Norvig's textbook. So most AI developers explicitly aim to build autonomous agents, and this can include things like self-driving cars, but also non-embodied AI systems like AlphaGo and Deep Blue. And I think it's also kind of a perspective that you often hear from outside the field. It kind of reinforces this idea that this is what AI is for. So when the media discusses the impact of AI, for example, it's often about how AI is automating jobs, or how robots might replace human workers, narratives like that. So we can say that one way that AI affects human cognition is just by automating some of what we can do with the goal of replacing our cognition. And this view also reflects, I think, an early vision of what computers are for. So early computers, for example, were used to solve numerical problems using pretty crude input and output devices without any real-time interaction with humans. And now some of these autonomous systems can actually afford us new cognitive opportunities that I think are worth discussing. And in fact, I'm actually working on a project exploring this in more detail in my current SRI project. And so hopefully I can share more on this at a later time. And Jacqueline knows I was kind of hemming and hawing about whether or not to talk about this or extended cognition today. But I thought I would just kind of say a little bit about what I mean here, and sort of hopefully pique your interest a little bit. And so the idea here, my favorite example of this, which I'll walk through with you, is AlphaGo's now famous move 37 in game 2 against the world champion player Lisa Dahl. So this move 37 was described as being surprising and even creative by some Go experts. But it was a move that no human player would ever make. In fact, the system itself estimated something like a 1 in 10,000 probability that a human player would make that move. And it decided to make the move anyways. And the reason that the move was unlikely to be played by humans was that it violated some of the templates and concepts and patterns that humans use to teach, learn, and play Go. So Go players often rely on conceptual linguistic tools like proverbs. So if you learn Go, for example, you'll learn that the second line is the route to defeat. So when one internalizes that proverb, that the second line is the route to defeat, it becomes difficult to see the second line as anything but that, arguably. But these proverbs can actually function as constraints as well on how we play. And so what move 37 did was violate that norm in a sense. So it did play a move on line 2. And so the philosopher Marta Helena, for example, has recently argued that these proverbs can lead to a kind of functional fixedness, whereas by contrast, through lots of exploration and playing tens of millions of games against itself, AlphaGo had discovered value functions that were radically different from these conceptual guidelines that serve as heuristics for human learning. So now, in fact, humans are trying to go back, human players are going back and learning from and training on some of the moves that AlphaGo made. And so I think that's kind of this interesting possibility we see of how AI can sort of generate new concepts or ideas or ways of problem solving that we can learn from. And of course, we're seeing other kinds of similar breakthroughs in domains that aren't just about game playing, but things like scientific discovery. So if you think of the recent breakthrough by AlphaFold in predicting the unfolding of protein structures, for example. So that's kind of another space I think that's really interesting and that I'm happy to talk more about later. But we'll move on now to what I call non-autonomous systems. So together, these different applications of AI reflect a competing vision of what computers were for that emerged in the 1960s from thinkers like Douglas Engelbart. So Engelbart is probably most famous for his role in creating the computer mouse and other sort of early features of early computers. But he also had this view that computers should be real-time interactive systems. I mean, the mouse was kind of reflective of that. So the idea that humans could work with computers in a way that where computers are supporting and expanding human problem-solving skills rather than replacing them. And this vision went on to influence a lot of developers like Alan Kay from Xerox and Steve Jobs from Apple. So Jobs, for example, wanted the personal computer to help you think better, right? So if you think about those classic Apple ads. So this sort of second vision is more about creating non-autonomous systems that can augment human cognition rather than replace human cognition. And so some examples are things like navigational systems or language translation systems. These systems use machine learning techniques, but they really don't do anything on their own. So they're not autonomous, and they're not really even attempting to replicate cognitive agents. They simply outsource a cognitive service or sub-process for an agent. And that agent might have varying levels of trust in the system. The agent might use the system as a one-off. The tool isn't particularly integrated in that case. And then you can kind of contrast that with a case where you have a non-autonomous AI system that is in fact being built to be tightly coupled with our biological capacities. So some tools are in fact so tightly coupled that the tool becomes essential for our completion of cognitive tasks. So in other words, without the device, completion of the task would not be possible. And these are the kinds of cases that I want to focus on for today. So this is what philosophers of cognitive science have called extended cognition. Okay, so in order to explain these cases of extended cognition with AI a bit more, I wanted to turn to the extended mind thesis. And I wasn't sure how many people would be familiar with this. I'm very sure that the philosophers among us are, but not sure about other folks. So I'm going to take a little bit of time to just walk through this view, or introduce the view, I guess, for those who really don't know it at all. So to begin with, here's what the extended mind thesis rejects. So here's a sense of sort of what the sort of standing views were in cognitive science before this thesis came around. So internalism, we'll call it, is a Cartesian commitment of traditional cognitive science that maintains that the mind is an information processing system that's instantiated entirely in neural networks in the brain. But this internalist view has been charged with being neurocentric, and that's sort of where the extended mind thesis comes in. So the extended mind thesis, by contrast, accepts that the mind is an information processing system, a core commitment of traditional cognitive science in itself, but it maintains that these networks that instantiate the mind can include more than just the neurons in the brain. So it can include tools in our environment, for example, like pens and papers or like smartphones, as I have pictured here. So the broad idea is that what matters is not where some thing is located or what it's made of, but rather the kinds of connections that exist between that tool or part and your overall cognitive system. So I'm just going to walk through a quick kind of schema of a standard argument that's given for this view. So if you're kind of thinking, why on earth should I accept something like this? Sounds like a bad idea. I'll give you kind of an argument for why. So, and there's a bit of jargon in here, so my apologies, I guess, for that. So as a first premise, we can say a physical state P is constitutive of a mental state of type M when P plays the role, the functional role characteristic of M in the system. So the idea here is just kind of a commitment to something like a role functionalism in philosophy of mind. And as a second premise, a physical state located partly beyond an agent's brain can play the functional role characteristic of certain mental states of type M. So this premise is kind of doing some heavy lifting. This is the premise that's saying, look, there's actually things that exist outside of the brain that can play that same role as things that typically occur in the brain. And so the philosophers who defended this view early on in philosophy of cognitive science, philosophers Andy Clark and David Chalmers, gave a kind of thought experiment to help support this idea, which I'll just walk you guys through. So we're meant to consider two agents. The first is Inga, and Inga is meant to be just like you or I. So we imagine that Inga hears about some exhibit at the museum that she wants to go to. So she thinks to herself, oh, I've been there before. I know where the museum is located. And so she heads in that direction and she successfully arrives at the museum, let's imagine. And so here we have just kind of a standard story of belief, desire, action. So she had a belief about where the museum was located. She had a desire to go, and that was enough to kind of bring her to that action successfully. So in Otto's case, so this other agent who's holding a smartphone in this picture, let's imagine his name is Otto, and we're meant to imagine that Otto hears about this exhibit at the museum, and he also wants to go. But for Otto, unlike Inga, he suffers from Alzheimer's disease, and so he relies on a notebook, which he records important information into in order to help structure his life. And so we're meant to imagine that for Otto, when he hears about the museum, he looks up the information in his notebook, he sees where the museum's located, and then he heads in that direction. And what Clark and Chalmers argue is that in the relevant respects, these two cases are entirely analogous. So the fact that the information is stored externally for Otto doesn't prevent him from successfully getting to the museum. In a sense, it really doesn't matter. So their claim is the skull does not represent a theoretically significant boundary. And you can imagine other cases of this without somebody suffering from Alzheimer's disease. So even just mathematicians, for example, often rely on external symbols to complete complex calculations. And the physicist Richard Feynman famously said that he thought with his pen and that the thinking occurred in his notebook. So these are the kinds of cases that the extended mind theorist has in mind. Good. Okay. I'll say more about that case as we go on, but that just to give you a bit of a picture. So the conclusion is that a physical state located partly beyond the brain can be constitutive of an agent's mental state. Okay, sorry. So before I go on, let me just be absolutely clear about what this view maintains in case it's a little bit elusive. So the idea is that auto and twin auto could be brain duplicates. So they could have molecule by molecule identical brains, but would nonetheless have different sets of standing beliefs precisely because auto has his notebook or his phone, while twin auto does not. So to be more precise for the philosophers, the extended mind thesis is a kind of vehicle externalism. So it's about the vehicles of mental states and not about their representational contents. So therefore different from the kind of content externalism, for example, that someone like Tyler Burge has defended. Okay, so I hope that was a good enough kind of quick introduction there. And now I'll just turn to using AI to extend one's cognition. So cognitive extenders, we can say, just based on what we've gone over so far, we can say that a cognitive extender is a kind of external physical or virtual element that is coupled to enable, aid, enhance, or improve cognition such that all or more than its positive effect is lost when that element is not present. And an AI extender, as we're calling them, is just a cognitive extender where some of the cognitive processes require the extender to have AI or to make use of AI. And we have this very broadly cast, so we're happy to include things like deep learning or reinforcement learning, other different types of techniques under this sort of broad umbrella. So the main idea of just drawing this distinction is to pull apart more static, simplistic artifacts of the kind that typically get discussed in these conversations around the extended mind from more sophisticated technologies that do some kind of interesting processing on their own. So one thing that got me excited about this topic was the fact that even though it was first defended relatively recently, the extended mind thesis maybe about 20 years ago, back then it was certainly, we didn't have smartphones. And at the time, and even since then, really, the discussions around the extended mind have really focused on very simple technologies. So things like a pen and paper, maybe a Venn diagram. Sometimes you'll have conversations about like a mise en place method used in cooking by chefs. So the kind of arrangement of ingredients to offload the task of having to remember the order of ingredients. So all of these are very sort of simple techniques that don't really do anything on their own. And so that's why we wanted to kind of draw this distinction at all, just to give you some motivation there. So basically the idea is that the impact of cognitive extenders that do have AI is sufficiently different, both from regular cognitive extenders and from other kinds of autonomous AI agents of the kind that I sort of started our conversation with. So things like self-driving cars. So it's sufficiently different from both of those things that the implications should be looked at separately. So that's kind of what got us thinking about this category. Okay, so let's look at sort of one example of an AI extender in a little more detail. And I've said that our phones are cognitive technologies that make use of AI and machine learning fairly extensively. And I just want to kind of cash that out a little bit in case anyone's skeptical of that claim. So a lot of times the phone itself is used to collect data. And then the actual sort of machine learning on a phone is done in the cloud or remotely. But onboard AI hardware is increasing. And I think many of us here probably already know that this is part of what distinguishes Apple's approach to some of its competitors. So Apple tries to perform, for example, machine learning tasks locally on the device. So they do this by equipping the phone itself with things like the Apple Neural Engine or the company's custom designed GPUs. And just to give you a sense of some of the features that you probably rely on every day to make some use of AI. that you may not kind of be aware of, because I think some of these applications are quite invisible to us, but together they hopefully make the point that these smartphones are really powerful and that they are AI-powered technologies that really are being used to extend our cognition. So just as a kind of a quick list here, some examples of the features that do use AI in your phone are things like voice assistants. So whether it's Siri or Alexa, voice to text dictation, text prediction, photography. So your iPhone actually takes, the newest ones, take multiple pictures in rapid succession. And then each time you take a picture, it's taking multiple pictures. And then a machine learning trained algorithm is analyzing those images and making a kind of composite of the best picture. So there's sort of a lot going on in the background, even when you take pictures on the newer phones. And then of course, security features like fingerprint and facial recognition, banking apps, email, spam filters, different kinds of personalization, recommender systems, and all of this is not even to mention what's going on in third-party apps. So there's lots of different applications here. And as I mentioned, extended mind theorists have discussed pretty simplistic technologies. There has been some discussion of smartphones. So for example, in 2008, in the foreword to Andy Clark's book, Supersizing the Mind, David Chalmers, who wrote the foreword, discusses, actually, I got an iPhone in the last couple of years, around 2005 maybe. And he says, now that's become a part of my mind. So there's sort of some discussion of these things, but I think the algorithmic power of smartphones has grown dramatically, especially over just the last few years. And not only because of their processors, but also because of how they're connected to cloud services. And to some extent, that really hasn't been discussed. So that's kind of what I want to focus on in the last section of the talk. But first, I thought I'll just sort of go through some of the dimensions of functional integration that often get discussed here. So if you aren't really convinced, that your phone really is a part of your mind or that it's really sort of tightly coupled to you, I want to go through some of these features to kind of say like what makes philosophers think that that's the case for some of our artifacts. So
Karina,
yeah.
sorry to interrupt you, and hi, sorry I was late. I just see David has his hand up. Is it a clarifying question, David?
Yeah, if you don't mind me interrupting, I just wanted to clarify on slide 22, the previous one. Do you mean functions that are AI, as in they provide kind of like some automation as opposed to learned functions that are trained off something? I'm not sure if the distinction is clear. Like, I guess some of these could be manually programmed, but they still provide some automation or help that so the user doesn't have to do it, as opposed to something that's learned from behaviors from other people or from the same user.
Yeah, that's a great question. To some extent, I'm not really making fine-grained distinctions here. So I really just wanted to point to the fact that there's a lot going on in your phone that's using these different techniques in different ways. And I'm kind of blurring over some of these finer grained distinctions about to what extent are some of these things being done either in the cloud or on the phone or by relying on other people's data or your own data. Is that kind of the distinctions that you're drawing?
Yeah, it's just a lot of people think of AI as machine learning, and I just wanted to clarify which one you meant. But
yeah.
Thank you.
Well,
I think that helps. That clarifies
okay.
it for me.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Thank you.
For the philosophers, I'm not sure if you are a philosopher, David, but there's also some pretty like thorny metaphysical issues here about, is it the information in the cloud? Is it the information on the phone? Exactly what part is being extended here? And I'm also kind of just blurring over those for now too. So as a kind of disclaimer.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Sure. Okay. So yeah, so where was I here? So well, I think that just because you hold a phone or you use it, it's a part of your mind, right? So I wanted to go over some of these dimensions of functional integration that people have discussed. And in fact, when Clark and Chalmers first published their paper on the extended mind thesis in '98, for those who don't know, this paper became sort of one of the most highly cited papers, I think, in the last 20 years in philosophy of cognitive science, at least, maybe even in philosophy more broadly. So it kind of made a huge splash. And there was a lot of debates, or a lot of what was written about it was debating exactly what are the conditions that we would want to say that a tool that one's using is actually part of one's mind, as opposed to just something that you've picked up and used. You don't want to say that everything on Google is a part of your mind. That's far too broad. It's an overextension, as we'd say. So you have to have some kind of way of distinguishing between the things that really are part of your mind and things you just use as tools. And so a lot of the debates surrounded these different types of conditions. So I'm presenting you with just 6 that I think are sort of broadly agreed, are in just some broad agreement that these 6 are important. But there's definitely not a straight consensus around these. And so I'll just walk you through them though, and sort of hopefully show you why I think there's some case to be made for thinking that a lot of these conditions are met for at least a lot of us a lot of the time, something like that. And another thing to note here is just that a lot of these conditions are relational, so they can sometimes like pull in different directions, and so it's not always sort of really clear cut whether or not something is a part of your mind. But again, I just commit that for many of us, a lot of these boxes are going to end up being ticked. So the first one that often gets discussed in the literature is constancy. So let's use our phones as an example here. How many of us can just reach with an arm's length away and pick up your phone, right? So I think for most of us, our phones are pretty much a constant in our lives. We carry them around with us pretty much everywhere we go. You know, certainly they're built to be portable, and they're built to be a regular feature in our life as well. They're accessible, so the information in our phones is easily accessible to us. It's often as easy or easier to rely on our phones to carry out certain cognitive tasks than our own biological resources, I would argue. So if you think about things like navigation. So accessibility here is about that kind of ease of information exchange. And reliability is about whether or not the device is sort of there when you need it. And so typically, I think these devices are quite reliable. Probably the least reliable thing about them is their batteries. Trust is a measure of the extent to which one implicitly endorses the information on the device. So this is how trust is understood in this context. So most of us don't question, for example, the veracity of what our phones tell us. If Google Maps sends us in a certain direction, we endorse that and we follow the directions. Kind of information flow. So for example, when Otto writes down information using a pen and paper, there's a kind of one-way information flow from his brain to his notebook. And when he later reads that information back, there's a kind of two-way information flow where there's a looping effect. And if Otto were to write some information down, maybe read it back, sort of push it around the page a little like mathematicians do, you know, you can start to see how a reciprocal flow of information could be established. And so I think that can happen with static artifacts, but I think it certainly does happen a lot with our phones as well. So when I rely on GPS navigation, for example, it's tracking my location, recording information about where I am. And at the same time, I'm reading information from the phone in order to try to figure out where to go next. So that's a kind of classic, I think, paradigm type of example of a reciprocal information flow. And then another condition that often gets discussed here is personalization. So the extent to which a device is useful only for the agent that's using it, as opposed to sort of anyone who picks it up. That's what we're trying to put our finger on here. So to the extent to which it's individualized versus interchangeable. So my phone, for example, has my calendar information, my photos, recordings of my home and work addresses, locations I've been to, you know, the groceries I'm going to order, number of steps I've taken, my health information. It's not really that useful for other people to that extent. And in fact, it only turns on when I look at it. So because even though it's really powerful, to some extent, it doesn't have that power to other people, right? It's become quite individualized. So it's not that interchangeable. So yes, so most of these conditions, I would argue, at least sort of at first glance, it looks like our phone does check a lot of these boxes for many of us, I think. So that's, again, just to make the case that these really, I think, should be considered a part of our minds, at least in some cases, at least some part of them, trying to work those out is those kind of harder questions. Another thing to mention there too is that those conditions are meant to reflect what we would say about the information stored in Inga's brain. So for example, for Inga, the information that she stores in her mind about where the museum's located is a constant in her life. It's readily accessible to her. She relies on it. She trusts the information. She stored the information there and she has to access it. So there's some kind of, reciprocal looping, arguably. So those conditions are also kind of meant to capture what's going on within the brain as well. Okay, so maybe I've convinced some of you that some of the time part of your phone is a part of your mind. What are the implications of this? So I wanted to walk through both some of the kind of benefits and challenges of taking this approach. So I think I'll actually skip 2 of these just for the purpose of time, but I can come back to these benefits. And the one that I really want to focus on is the kind of sophistication that a device has. So I think that one reason that talking about AI extenders is interesting is because they have the opportunity to provide more sophisticated resources than regular extenders or things like a static notebook. And I've already touched on this a little bit, but I just wanted to kind of emphasize that as one of sort of the main opportunities here. So I won't go through all of these, but in this paper, or in our first paper on this topic, Jose and I discuss 14 different capacities that we think AI could extend. And this ranges from things like memory processes and communication, navigation, things that maybe sort of a standard cognitive extender could assist with, but also to things that really we think are quite unique to an AI extender. So something like attention and search, or mind modeling and metacognition. Some of these are based on the fact that something like a smartphone is able to collect so much information about you that it can give you a better model of kind of your own mind and limitations and biases to provide you with a sort of a heightened type of extension that a regular device couldn't. So while it's of course the case that writing was a transformative invention in human history, and it certainly, I think, augmented much of our cognitive capacities, arguably there's limitations to what we can do with that. And it seems that our smartphones are able to sort of take this to a whole new level in terms of our understanding and awareness of what's going on in our social environments, in our physical environments, and sort of internally in our own minds as well. So to make this sort of a little bit more obvious, in the literature on extended cognition, you sometimes get cases, or there's sometimes this discussion between or about using another person as a kind of tool to extend oneself. So actually there's a lot of literature, for example, on how the extended mind thesis can inform mental health more broadly. And certain examples of that really illustrate this. So there's a bit of background here. So the standard view, if you go back to internalism, is that the mind stands, maybe the mind isn't identical to the brain, but it stands in some kind of really close metaphysical relation to the brain. Maybe it's not an identity relation, but it's some kind of close supervenience relation. And therefore, if you think that the mind does stand in that relation to the brain, then you might think that most mental disorders, in order to understand them or to treat them, you really just have to look at the brain, because that's where you're going to find some kind of brain disorder that explains that mental disorder. And so some of the literature on the extended mind thesis has emphasized the extent to which we may need to look outside the brain to try to figure out the origination of certain cognitive disorders. And one example of this comes from the author Amanda Bray. Sorry, I have some environmental noise here. I'm just going to close the window. I'm not sure if that made a difference. So Amanda Bray discusses the case of borderline personality disorder, and she argues, so this condition is characterized by symptoms like becoming really dependent on partners really quickly, or being quite devastated if a partner leaves you. So forming quite close relationships very quickly. And what she hypothesized, another symptom here is that there tends to be a deficit in one's metacognitive capacities. And so what Amanda Bray hypothesizes, and I'm seeing here that I've forgotten a reference to her paper here, I'm using this as an example, so my apologies for that. But her hypothesis is that, in fact, what somebody with borderline personality might be trying to do is try to find some sort of tool in the environment to compensate for their own onboard metacognitive deficits. And so a way to do that is to rely on somebody else who's able to help them, let's say, make complex decisions or guide their behaviors in some way. And there's other examples of using another person as a kind of cognitive tool. So we see this in highly interdependent couples, for example, too. Maybe one person remembers everybody's names in your social group, and maybe you have a kind of implicit arrangement with your partner where they remember names and you remember directions or something like that. Those types of kind of social extensions can emerge implicitly in couples, it's argued. So one thing that's interesting about AI extenders is that they may be able to provide some of those higher order cognitive capacities for a person, something like a metacognitive skill or the degree of personalization that one would find in social extension, even to assist things like emotional or self-control without having to rely on another person to do that. And often what happens in the cases of borderline personality disorder is that somebody can form a tight bond very quickly and will be quite devastated if that relationship ends suddenly. So for example, we think that there's a kind of opportunity for something like an AI extender to provide the same kind of aid to a person to supplement some kind of onboard deficit without having those similar risks of abandonment or a requirement for reciprocation. So in other words, a device can provide a more stable connection over time. So opportunities like that, we're kind of interested in investigating. But I'm still doing okay for time. Benjamin, I think I am, right? Just check. Oh yeah, okay.
Yeah,
oh.
Yeah, you're good.
Okay, thank you. All right, great. Okay, so I wanted to look at some of the challenging implications of AI extenders. I wasn't quite sure how to phrase them. I don't want to say risks necessarily, but I think they are sort of implications that emerge. So the first is about privacy. So effective coupling with our AI assistants seems to require a certain degree of personal information. And so I think naturally we have to worry about who has access to this information and how that information is being used. But also I think there's sort of interesting implications here for sort of how we protect privacy. So traditionally, a lot of democratic constitutions will protect, for example, freedom of thought, will offer certain protections of our brain. Let me actually move to the next slide here. Yeah. So yes, so a lot of constitutions will protect something like freedom of thought or freedom of speech. And in these traditions, what usually gets special protections is the body or the brain. So you can't force somebody to take medication, for example, that's going to interfere with their cognitive performance unless you have some kind of doctor's permission or a medical reason to do that. Somebody can't be forced to take a lie detector test, in part because it could self-incriminate, but also because it sort of forces one to reveal information. So all of these kind of standard protections in the law have protected a sort of standard conception of what a person is. So the fact that this sort of traditional Cartesian view that the person really just is their brain and maybe their body. And I think that potentially by taking this broader view of what the mind is, we have a way of offering protections to more than just the brain and body. So one can argue, look, part of what's on your phone really is a part of who you are. And as a result, it merits greater protections. And in fact, I'm kind of skipping ahead here to moral status. So the artifact's sort of moral status or even legal status might need to be sort of proportionate to the role that that tool has in the person's cognitive life. So different philosophers have kind of made this point in different ways about the extended mind. But one example is the idea that if you were to take my phone from me, for example, yeah, you're taking some of my private information, you're taking my property, but you're also kind of, affecting me cognitively. So it's more than just theft. Stealing my phone for me is like kicking me in the head. It's causing a real deficit in my performance, at least temporarily. So there's a case to be made that these devices, I think, need more sort of moral protection or moral recognition, I guess. And I sort of skipped some of these points here, but they sort of fall out of that. So the idea is that if your mind really is in your phone, then not only is the information in there quite private, really personal. In fact, I've argued in other places that your phone, to some extent, knows more about you than your brain does, or it stores a lot of information that your brain can't, including phones, emails, messages to people, records of where you've been, how many steps you've taken, when you responded to people, what you said, purchases you've made, notes to yourself. It has all of this information with a perfect record going back years, whereas your brain misremembers things, your brain forgets things, your brain's doing all of this stuff in the background to kind of protect you and promote your ego or your social standing or so forth. So there's a lot of information there that can be quite personal. And really, I think if we're offering protections to the brain and body, there might be a case to extend those protections. And then sort of tied up in that privacy concern is the idea that that information can be used, and it can be used by people other than you when it's out in the world. And it is being used by other people than you. And it can be used, for their ends. And unlike the case of just a regular notebook, which doesn't have any interests, really, these devices have some kind of interest, maybe not their own interest, but the interest of some kind of third party in certain cases. And so we have to be quite mindful of the idea that there's some kind of agent besides ourselves that has different interests than us that can also have this direct access to our minds and really a direct way of influencing our ability to act on our own reasons, as I say there. And yes, so I did this out of order. So the other concern that I think is kind of an important or challenging implication of AI extenders is the question of responsibility. So as one becomes more tightly integrated with one's devices, I think just the line gets blurred. So it becomes harder to know when to credit an agent or when to credit the tool. And in some cases that can be quite thorny. So if you think about the idea of art production, I'm thinking of some of the really interesting cases that Professor Slater discussed in her talk, for example. So it's hard to know both when to credit, when to give credit to somebody, but also when to hold somebody responsible as those sort of lines blur. And I'm not coming to you with answers on sort of when to draw those lines or how to make assessments there, but I think it's kind of one of the things that I'm thinking about is how to make sense of that over time as we become sort of increasingly integrated with these devices. I think I'll end there. So I'm sure that we can have some conversation about these as well. So yeah, thank you.
Great. Thanks, Karina. That was terrific. Do you want to stop the share and then we'll get everybody up here? And I'm sorry I was late for the start of the meeting and I missed the beginning of the talk, but thanks, Benjamin, for stepping in to get us going. Let's see, I think we have a couple of questions queued up from a couple of our grad fellows, and then I'll come to Jennifer and Reed. Oh, I've got Reed on the list. Charlotte, are you here?
Hi, yes, I'm here.
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, so thank you for the talk. It was really interesting, and I'm wondering about, you mentioned social extenders and how we can rely on people to think about know facts about people's names, etc. But with an AI, when we rely on another person, we kind of know where their answers are coming from and what might motivate their answers. But with AI, we don't have that same theory of mind available. And so I'm wondering, do you think it's important when we think of AI to think of it as an autonomous agent in order to be able to quantify or qualify what kind of data might be motivating it in its answers and how we rely on it?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So I do agree with you that this is sort of one of many kind of important distinctions between using a human or as a social extender or using a tool, is trying to figure out their interests and motivations. And I also agree that we maybe have some sort of special access to, through theory of mind, or better access to sort of trusting another human agent. I would be reluctant to think of just any AI system as an autonomous agent, even it's just kind of a heuristic to figure out what its intentions are, because I think part of what's helpful of distinguishing something, just sort of that broad distinction I made early on between an autonomous agent and a non-autonomous agent, is that I think we're more likely to be able to attribute an autonomous agent, especially an agent that comes closer to replicating a full cognitive agent, not the kind of autonomous agents we have now, which typically replicate just really small, narrow parts of cognitive agents. But something like a full cognitive agent, then we could say, oh, it has interests of its own in some sense. Whereas I think basically everything else doesn't have interests of its own. And it's not useful to think of it as something that has interests of its own, because really it's something that's been designed by somebody or some team of people with some kind of purpose. And I think if we kind of blur past that, we might lose what its interests are. So if you think about the non-autonomous systems we have, if it's a language translation system or, or a smartphone navigational system, I don't, for me, that's not helpful to think of those as having interest in their own right, but as maybe serving some kind of purpose by the designer. So I'm not sure if that answers your question. You look like maybe it didn't, so I'll let you.
No, yeah, thank you very much.
Okay.
Thanks very much. Reed.
Hey, yeah, this is a wonderful talk. I found it really interesting, and particularly the stuff you're talking in the beginning, I'd love to hear more about at some point, as it's sort of related to my work. But more talking about this stuff, I was sort of wondering, like, when you're talking about these AI agents that are sort of extending the mind, you talk about stuff like, what was it, the mind modeling and social interaction. And I sort of see that as sort of being fundamentally different than something like navigation or even translation, like relatively complex artificial intelligence tasks. I can see how those I can sort of conceptualize as being part of me. But when you talk about stuff like mind modeling or these things that really, like, I don't really understand how that I can, as someone who's using the tool, consider to be an agent of me. It's something that's being imposed upon me. It's like if my significant other is reminding me of something, is sort of different from them just always telling me the name of someone.
Okay, yeah, great. So here's what I had in mind. What we had in mind was something like, let's say that I'm really bad at mind modeling. I'm really bad at understanding what other people are thinking or what peers think of me or whatever it is. And we could have a system that not only models myself. So we have systems that are really good at knowing about a person, right? So we have systems that can predict my personality better than my family can, things like that. But we could also use a system like that that then models people in my social network and then informs me and helps me make better decisions based on that information about your or other people's minds. So to the extent that we can get some kind of feedback about the people in our networks, and then that can help me understand and get a better either perspective of myself or some sort of aid in my decision making. That's kind of what I had in mind. And then if you really do trust that tool and it meets all those conditions,
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Cool.
Great. I'm actually going to ask Wendy Wong to jump the queue here because she has to drop off very quickly, and her talk last week so related. So with apologies to Jennifer Schach and Shabnam and Brian. Wendy.
Sorry, everyone. I can't figure out why my camera's not working. So it was great talk, Karina. It's so interesting. And it's so neat to hear about some of the sort of same quandaries, but you're approaching it from a very different perspective. So here's what I'm thinking about, and just listening to the last part of your talk, especially thinking about like some of the quandaries that have come up. in thinking about how these AI extenders can be, you know, thought of as a part of a person, but then we need to think about how to protect people if that's the case, or protect the persons and their extenders. I wonder how the notion that a lot of the data and a lot of the information on our extenders are not just based on us, right? They're based on our interactions with other people. So like I'm thinking about social media, emails, texts, photos, all these different things are about us, but also about our interactions with other people. And so how do we think about those kinds of moral quandaries if the data are not just our own, but are inevitably social and involve other people?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. I still think by protecting, so I guess the way I think about it is that some of that information, so I might, on my phone, I have information, let's say, about some people in my social group, and that by protecting my privacy, so let's say that my privacy rights help protect my phone, that will just grant some extra protection to those people in my network too. Like that would also protect them in a sense, or give some extra protection to them. So the kind of cases I'm thinking of are cases where, for example, and I think we've discussed about these cases, Wendy, but there were some cases that went up to the US Supreme Court. You know, the one that made the headlines was like Apple trying to get into the phone of the San Bernardino killer, I think. But there's been lots of cases like this where the police need to get into phones, either somebody's gone missing or a murder's happened, whatever it is. Suspected crime. And so one of these cases went up to the Supreme Court where somebody's phone was seized under SITA, so search incident to arrest. They were arrested for like a routine traffic stop. And then the police seized their phone, and then the police decided that they were going to search their entire phone. They were going to use that as grounds to search their entire phone. And then in this case, what they found was evidence of another crime, and then they ended up charging them of this other crime. And so anyways, this went up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, look, you can't just use SITA, grab somebody's phone, and then search their entire phone. That would be like using SITA, getting the keys to your house, and then searching your entire house. You know, that's good. That's just totally an overreach. And actually, the Supreme Court Justice John Roberts had this quote in his written opinion where he said, the phone, our smartphones today, are like an extension of our bodies. So he said something like, if a proverbial visitor from Mars were to land on Earth, they would think that our phones are a part of our anatomy because the way that everybody walks around like this all the time, you know, attached to it. And so he used that as grounds to kind of give further protections and say, you know what, police can't, unless they have a warrant, we're not going to let police search your phones if they grab it under search incident to arrest. And so that was a kind of way of grounding that extension of the protection. And so that's the kind of idea I have in mind. So I think by using that as a way to kind of extend the protections that are already there by recognizing that integration of the phone, I think that can just improve one's protections in general.
Thank you. Thank you for letting me jump the queue.
All right. Thanks, Wendy. Jennifer.
Thanks so much for your talk, Karina. So something I noticed was that you're understanding AI extenders in a very positive way. You describe them as being there to enhance, aid, improve cognition. And, you know, I love this. And not to say anything bad about Apple, but I wonder sometimes if you want to leave space for an idea of extensions of our agency that might not actually constitute aiding, enhancing, and improving, right? Like these devices can be also, you know, steering us in various problematic directions. Yeah, I guess I'm just kind of curious about that, whether that was a deliberate choice on your part to just count as AI extenders the stuff that's good, and if so, good in what way? Good by whose standard?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you, Jennifer. I know I wasn't intending that. So in fact, like I included manipulation, although I didn't really emphasize it in this talk, but I do think like manipulation, for example, is a real risk of using your smartphone as some kind of extension in that way for precisely the reasons you say. So there's sort of, you know, mixed up questions of agency there and who, it may not be an improvement. So you're right. So I think I should sort of fix that definition. And I think there's a lot of opportunity for improvement, and I get excited about that. But then there's also these risks, which I do want us to be aware of and mindful of. And I think that's the best approach. Not to just like stop using technology, but to just really be mindful of it. So yeah, thank you. That's good.
Thanks.
Super. Ishtiaq.
Thanks, Karina. It's a wonderful talk. I really like the idea of AI extender and the way you explain this. Well, I had a couple of questions, but most importantly, I wanted to know your take on the idea of skills and craft. You mentioned that people are using their mobile phones as an extended part of their memory or cognition. The same way they also use some of their social peers for remembering something or getting some kind of other social skills, for example, like mapping other people's mind. Then it also brings us to the question that not everyone who has the same tool has the same level of mastery of using this. For example, like a lot of people can play guitar, but not all of them become a master player, right? So where comes this difference then between a person's cognition and the tool where will they do that mastery? So that's the fundamental question. And I'm asking this not as a question of something that a person individually achieve, but also as a community level. Because when you are even saying that this mind mapping, that as a person, I want to understand how other people in my community think, but the other people, they are also thinking through their phones. So they have also extended their cognition. So as a society, we might need to develop some kind of skills, and there might be some moral and ethical standard how we do it to probably encounter this new AI extenders. This is my take, and I want to hear more from you. If we fail to do that, then might be, as you say, there might be a chance of manipulation, and the whole system might use us as human extender of AI. I don't know.
Yeah,
but
thank you. That's such a great question. I've never really thought about this. So it's really interesting. But yeah, I think you're right. There's a huge role for individual differences in how well someone interacts with a tool. And I think that's probably way more heightened. Like I think you put your finger on a really important difference between something like how well one interacts with a smartphone or how adept one is at interacting with that, as opposed to just like a pen and paper, where for the most part we undergo enough education where everyone becomes pretty well integrated with writing. So yeah, that's interesting. And so as part of the question, sort of to what extent that causes challenges in society, like in terms of access to the tool, I think I'm trying to get at what underlies that concern of yours.
Yeah, I think so, even for like a very basic example, say like a rich people will have more device, like more sophisticated AI device. So
Okay.
Are they going to be cleverer than the poorer people?
Yeah. Okay, great. I was just wanting to make sure that's kind of where my mind went. So I wanted to make sure that was your concern too. Yes, so I do think there's questions of access that are a real challenge, and to some extent, in my view, no different than a lot of other technologies, right? Because like you've just said, we see those socioeconomic divides everywhere, and we're seeing them here too, right? So not surprising. There's also other divides, I think important age divides that probably are worth mentioning too. So I think to some extent, there's probably a bit of a window. I don't want to say a critical period, but there's a window where technology is easier to adopt, and a window where it becomes harder to adopt new technologies. And so, as these sort of new technologies come out, I not to throw shade on my older sister, but even she, I feel like, is reluctant to get new apps sometimes. And I'm like, okay, like this is going to be a huge improvement. So yeah, I think there's a real barrier to that. And I think to the extent that once we start recognizing that there are these different roles for AI, there's autonomous AI and there's non-autonomous AI, and there's different things that are trying to be accomplished through these tools, and we're more mindful of that, both as developers and policymakers and thinkers or users, I think we can be a lot more intentional about how we train people and why we train people, or how we develop things and why we develop them. So I think, yeah, I think we can be sort of better at that in a sense.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Great. Shutdown.
Great. I actually was trying to lower my hand because the questions were very much, but I'll take a stab at it. It could be just a quick, maybe a conversation, very small conversation. And it was about your thoughts, Karina. And first of all, thank you for the very, very interesting talk about the point release, because you talked about the type of, and I apologize if I get the word wrong, but the types of AI extenders, like different, there was a category, I think, from your work and your colleague. And there is a point, I just want to distinguish this, where I think you talked about both perceiving AI as an extension of our mind as a person, and a line where it would be important to capture that distinction because it may have implications on accountability. So I wonder, what are your thoughts on related to the types of AI extenders that you talked about, the line where a tool becomes from, like, a tool that I am accountable for using will become a tool that should be accountable for what it projects, I guess, out in the world. And in the information processing part, we can talk about, like, action, decision, that sort of thing. But I think what you were getting at in terms of manipulation is really more fundamental, lower level. So I just wanted to bring that up. I hope I posed the question clearly.
Yeah, thank you. Right. So yeah, I think there's an important question about to what extent when a person, let's say, becomes quite functionally integrated with the tool, to what extent do we credit the person or hold the person responsible? And that line is quite, I think, blurry and complicated for various reasons. So I think there are cases where, let's say, an artist uses the tool to create some work of art where we're inclined to give credit to the artist and not the tool, maybe to the sort of artist and tool together unit. And it's sort of unclear, I think, when it's one or the other, or how we make those distinctions. And then there are sort of maybe more important, well, I don't want to say more important, but at least as important cases where it's about sort of not so much credit, but responsibility. So if something goes wrong, who do we hold responsible? And those questions, obviously, we're already seeing with whether it's self-driving cars or something else. So yeah, I think those questions are kind of to be asked here too, certainly. And I don't have clear sense myself of what we're to say here. So even if we think about a toy example of like the Google Maps. So, Google Maps told my dad to go, take a shortcut, and he ends up going through some private property where he's like off-roading in a minivan and gets stuck. And he's blaming Google Maps, and I'm blaming him. And I think there's a role to spread that blame, I think too. But I don't have clear answers on these questions, but I do think there's, to the extent that he is over trusting the machine, I mean, that's really the question here, right? So we're so used to integrating into these machines, and I think they can provide us a lot through that implicit trust. But there's also a role for us as agents to be more critically reflective of what it's telling us. And yeah, I guess I don't have a clear answer on sort of what I think is,
But I guess I got the answer to the fact that there is a distinction between how we perceive AI to be part of us or not, or how it should be perceived by society in terms of accountability. It could be very different, things, because extender in my head comes with, yeah.
Thank you. Okay, that's a slightly different question. I missed that. So, right. It could be the case that there's an agent, and some of us might be in the audience, some skeptical people who, in my view, the phone really is a part of their mind. They've become so reliant on it, but they may be, reluctant to accept that view, and they may not feel that way themselves. So I'm not totally sure what to make of cases like this. I mean, I think in my view, somebody can be wrong about themselves. They can, you can be mistaken, right? I mean, Lots of philosophers, I guess, have been mistaken about where they think their minds are. So the fact that they, may not feel that way, I mean, doesn't make it not true. And so I do think that like we want to have some way of, making these kinds of assessments from a third person perspective. And I think that's probably more helpful in terms of getting traction around protections as well. And so, and if it ends up being the case that we give protections where they shouldn't be, that might not be a bad thing either. So if we end up sort of over protecting things, I think that would be an error in the right direction rather than under protecting.
Thank you.
Super. Thanks, Brian.
Yes, thanks very much, Karina. It's great to have Clark and Chalmers brought into this community and discussion and so on and so forth. So I really appreciate that. My question has to do with, so you said that this example raises challenges to the Cartesian conception of the individual mind. My main beef with Descartes is not actually his individual and distinct ideas, which everything he tries to do is to, my iPhone is part of my mind. I would say, well, sort of. In some ways, yes. In some ways, no. And
Brian?
Clark and Chalmers.
Yeah, I'm having trouble hearing Brian.
The question of is this our mind? Like, is it auto? Is it your answers? Yeah. Oh, okay.
Right.
I don't know, try to talk slower. Sorry, I don't have great internet connection. So,
Brian, do you want to put in your, Brian?
All right, so I try to get to the point. My worry is that these questions, but you really can't hear.
Maybe you could type, or someone suggested for
maybe
camera.
Brian, let me suggest you put your question in the chat. I'll go to Lisa, and then I will come back to it.
What you suggested. I don't know if I'm supposed to keep going.
Brian, please put your question in the chat. And then I will read. And I will go to Lisa while we're waiting for that.
Okay.
So Karina, great talk. So super interesting. I was wondering, I guess my question goes to this idea that the extended mind can, I'm sort of intrigued by this idea, and it sounds right to me that it can help with a more introspection, right? The self-knowledge. And there's so many of these products that are, and currently on my phone too, that say, we're going to give you these insights, including actionable insights into your own behavior. And it just seems to me that there's something different generally between that and, say, using Google Maps or my reliance on some of these tools to sort of navigate the world when I'm thinking about kind of how I understand myself. And sometimes we use other people to help us understand ourselves in really sort of specific kinds of relationships. You think of therapeutic relationships, you think of even just a doctor-patient relationship, or your financial advisor, or any of these sorts of folks. You're sharing a lot of personal information in order not to, to eventually act in the world, but you're sharing it with them in order to get advice. And so they give you advice in this kind of very special context. And they have all sorts of fairly serious professional obligations in relation to that. So there's a whole set of not just laws, but ethics, right? And obligations around the giving of that advice. And so I'm kind of curious as to when is an extended mind just an extended mind? And when is there this, but they seem to also in some of these contexts and blur into, some people have been noting that the potential manipulative aspect to it, but I don't mean just the kind of limit case of you're being manipulated, but there's, you know, you're actually being advised in some way, right? There's you're being prodded in some way, you're being advised in some way. And to what extent is that then, if we say it's an extended mind, are we sort of, you know, erasing that social side of it where, you know, in, again, the kind of analog world, when people do that, they actually have some pretty heavy duty social, ethical, and legal obligations in relation to that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great question. Thank you. I guess, so I guess I want to say in those cases, so in some of the cases you described of the human interaction, I would be more reluctant to call it a part of your mind. And it may have just been a random selection of cases you gave. I'm not sure, but just because it seems like some of the integration conditions wouldn't be met in those cases. So if it's like, if you're relying on advice from a therapist, usually, you know, you see that therapist maybe once a week. They're not sort of a regular, consistent part of your life. You know, some of the other conditions there as well, like to the extent that you rely on them or question the veracity of their advice, those sorts of things. But I still take your point that by calling some parts of your phone, some of these potentially manipulative parts, a part of your mind, I know, do we risk not having certain protections on how they behave? I think that's kind of the concern, I take it. And yes, I think that's a good concern. I'll have to think more about it. I think so. Part of my answer here, part of what's complicated and what I've sort of hand waved over so far in publications up until some work that I'm doing is that we talk about the phone like it's one thing, or I've talked about the phone like it's one thing, and there's lots of different things going on there, and some of that I think maybe might be a part of your mind and meet those conditions, and some of it might not be. So I think my hope is that sort of the more developed response that I will be able to give is that the things that you're concerned about, the things that are kind of more manipulative or that have their own interests, we can still kind of regulate in the way that we would regulate other people's behavior in the real world. And even if that person is a part of your mind. So if you think about a case of an executive, let's say, who relies on her assistant to extend her mind, something like that, you know, the assistant is providing certain cognitive resources for her, arguably, but at the same time, the assistant is subject to some kind of regulations. You know, there's things they can't do, things they can do. There might be non-disclosure clauses and so forth. So there can still be sort of regulation around how it behaves. So that, I guess that would be kind of the hope, that we could get to a point where we have systems that if we know that the system is going to be, you know, either serving some kind of important role in a person's life or giving, let's say, critical advice or advice on, you know, counsel on important things, that there can be regulation on how those apps are developed. And to some extent, I think we do see this around mental health apps, for example. There is regulation on some of those and what's allowed to be done through, you know, if it's CBT through telemedicine, just for example. Don't know if that answers your question fully, but.
Yeah, but I think actually you have a stronger answer in the sense that by saying that these you know, tools can be part of your extended mind, it might be a way of trying to, like, if you played with that, to say that how we regulate that actually look different than how we would regulate therapists. Like there's this additional component there, right? Because it becomes so tied up in oneself, even though there is this other component that is normally another person and we regulate separately, that maybe that actually heightens certain kinds of obligations, even if it changes others.
Lisa had a comment very much as I was thinking, so I just want to insert myself a little bit here, because I actually want a different direction to say that, you know, the fact that AI extenders are sort of inscrutable and beyond our capacity to perhaps understand and control in the same way that, if I write in a notebook or I use a map, I sort of have the capacity to completely be in charge of that. But if I am taking recommendations, not even realizing I'm taking recommendations from a system, and I was thinking about how that creates a set of ethical, and which we may want to frame then into legal and regulatory duties on the producers of those. It's very different that the producer of the AI extender map is actually under a different set of ethical duties and then, as I say, regulatory duties. So I just wanted to throw that in there. I want to get to Brian's question, which he's put into the chat, so I'll read it out for you. So even Clark and Chalmers think the question of whether the iPhone is part of your mind has a clear answer, but Brian doesn't buy that. Don't buy Descartes' valorization of clear and distinct ideas. His answer to the question would be some sort of, in some ways yes, in some ways no, and more generally thinks that a real challenge posed by AI and computing is how to deal with non-sharp boundaries. Many philosophers think of such questions under the notion of vagueness, but vagueness may be the right approach. Think of AlphaGo's grasp of the game with Lee Sedol. There was nothing vague about its grasp of that position when it made move 37. So my sense is that the deep question posed by AI is, how can we learn to think deeply without requiring sharp ontological boundaries or lines?
That's a hard question.
Did you know it was coming there? That's right. And
No,
you mentioned it's a longer conversation.
Yeah, there's a twist at the end for me. So thank you, Jillian, for reading that out, and thanks, Brian, for the question. Just to go back to your comment, Jillian, first, I just wanted to say that I do agree with that. So the idea that both sort of developers and policymakers may need to treat this sort of category of AI in a different way, and I think that's true, and that's part of the argument that we make in our paper. So yeah, I'm on board with that. Brian, I agree with you. So when I say, the mind extends, I kind of do mean sort of in some ways yes, in some ways no. So the truth is that it's part of the mind extends, some of it doesn't, so it's more of a complicated answer, really. But the idea is that there's some kind of, let's say, mereological supervenience between the mind and the brain plus. So not just the brain, but the brain and something. So yeah, and what I've focused on and the examples I've focused on now are that kind of information that instantiates intentional states, which is just one part of the mind. Of course, there's so many other parts of the mind that maybe don't extend, like consciousness, and other things. So I'm open to that for sure. And then I'm kind of taking your question in parts here as I scroll down, because my memory is limited. Yes, so the question of vagueness. So I agree with your example that there's nothing vague about the move 37. I think for me, the vagueness, I think that it's less clear whether or not we can exclude vagueness in the examples of, the blurring of the mind and the tool. That is where the vagueness for me is sort of, so it's the non-autonomous AI systems, in other words, for me, that where the vagueness really comes in more to play. And not sort of the autonomous AI systems where they seem to be, they're designed to function on their own. So the vagueness isn't as apparent. They're meant to be, they're not meant to rely on constant interactions. And so in some sense, it makes sense that they're more easily distinguished as sort of clear units on their own, at least in my mind. So something like a self-driving car or AlphaGo. Now, your question on, so how can we learn to think deeply without requiring sharp ontological boundaries or lines? I'm not sure how to answer this question. I do think so, to the extent that one reason I don't get too upset about the concern about whether or not we can say yes or no, is the phone a part of my mind or Brian's mind or whoever's mind, is that I don't think we're ever going to be fully satisfied with the yes or no answer there. I do think that those dimensions of functional integration, allow a kind of gray space between when something sort of maybe clearly is a part of the mind and when something is not so clearly a part of the mind, and some room in between. And I guess I've always kind of just been okay with the idea that there's going to be some clear cases and there's going to be some blurry cases. but that's not always a satisfying answer for some people. So yeah, I think, and I think, I guess to the extent that we want to ground protections of the mind or protections of privacy in something like the extended mind, which is the approach I'm suggesting, I may need to get more clear about those boundaries. So there may be a bit of an obligation on my part to be more clear there. But I think in reality, as a philosopher, I'm kind of okay with the fact that there are these blurred lines.
Great, thanks, Karina.
Yeah, I'm trying to gauge Brian's visual reaction, but it may just be maybe a lacking video. So I don't know.
Right. Well, we'll lots of opportunity to continue. We have about 8 minutes and 2 questions showing here. Dennis?
Thanks, Karina. I love this stuff. I really, really enjoy it. Thanks very much. That said, I have a suspicion that my question is unfair. So an answer open to you is that that's totally unfair. So here's the question. If we accept this extended mind stuff, and I'm perfectly happy to do that, what does that tell us about what a mind is? And here's why I ask. So, I mean, prior to this, we were probably inclined to think of a mind as something like an organ. And it's on board and it does stuff for us. And and if that's right, then we think of the mind as, say, that which thinks. So my liver is that which purifies my blood or tries to, right? And it's not, my liver isn't that with which I purify my blood, right? But if we take the extended mind notion of what constitutes a mind, it's more like a resource. It's that with which I do my thinking, right? And that raises the question about the grounds on which my extended cognition or my extended cognition apparatus is to be respected or preserved, right? It's pretty clear that I have a right to like non-intervention on the integrity of my liver because it's one of my organs, right? But I don't have rights to all the resources I use in my everyday life. I might like keep track of the time, you know, by the shadow that my neighbor's tree casts, but I don't have a right to that. It's a resource, but I don't have, it's not protected as mine. So it does raise the question about the grounds on which we protect our cognitive resources, if they're merely resources. I guess it's quite a bit like the issues you touched on with Jillian and Lisa. So.
Okay, thank you, Dennis. Yeah, that's a great question. So I think you're right that there's a sense in which the person is using the resource as a tool for thinking and not as the thing that's thinking itself. I think I agree with that. I have to think that through a little bit more. I don't want to agree too quickly. But I do think that there's some, I don't think it's just, for example, the biological agent that traditionally gets some kind of protection. So for example, there's a long-standing recognition that your house is a kind of extension of yourself. And in the way that you can't walk into a person's home, you need a warrant. You know, there's certain special protections of one's home, for example, and that's not grounded in the extended mind necessarily, of course, but I think it can kind of give room for looking at the person as, you know, we don't just protect the person, we protect the person and their kind of immediate needs to be who they are, in a sense. When we protect freedom of speech, we don't just protect one person talking, we protect also the means in which people can speak. So there's some protections on saying, look, it's not just that you can say words out loud, you're allowed to say things on the internet. And that's a kind of technology and a way of communicating that's protected. So it's not just the content, in other words, it's the means or the that's protected in a lot of these cases, actually, as I'm trying to think of other examples, but at least there's a few. So I think there's some grounds to think, well, it's not just thought that we're protecting. Well, it's not just that you can have thoughts, you know, that's just the content, but it's the means by which that thinking is done. Arguably, that could have some protections there. So
Yeah.
So I guess maybe I'm thinking maybe I can agree with you that distinction early on is the case, but there's still some way to protect within existing frameworks those tools.
Right. Yeah. Right. No, I think that's really helpful. But then again, so at that point, then the lack of a boundary, getting back to Brian's question, becomes salient, right? So you'd have to at least show for anything you want, any cognitive resource that you want protected, it falls on the right side of the personalized or means boundary. Like it's as much a part of your cognitive apparatus as your house is a part of you, or something like that. So,
yeah, that's right. And I think there have been cases like that for people with cognitive deficits. So cases like special protections of a wheelchair or something like. I think there's cases where people need certain technologies to accomplish pretty core thinking or speech. So, whether it's through some kind of paralysis or other conditions. So I think there are some grounds for that for cognitive deficits, but maybe not as much for somebody who's just considered neuronormative or whatever.
Yeah.
I'm gonna jump in just because I'd like to see if we could get Neil's last question in here. Just a couple of minutes to go. Sorry, Dennis.
Oh, that's fine.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for the talk, Karina. It's nice to hear from you. My question was, and maybe this is about the boundary question as well, that you sort of draw the distinction between autonomous and non-autonomous AI, but of course that's a very blurry line as well. Like self-driving cars could be using adaptive cruise control, or they could just be driving the car for you. So what is the implication of this blurry line for cognitive extension? If is it become not part of our mind anymore if it's just doing it for us?
Yeah, great question. And you're totally right. And I didn't really explicitly point to this, but that diagram I first showed you guys was meant to be kind of a line with two arrows in which there weren't clear boxes or distinctions. So I definitely am sympathetic to that idea and to the idea that the car itself might have its own kind of onboard systems that do different things. So all of this is very blurry. and in the case of so your question was for the case of extended mind, what does that mean? I think we definitely want to say, so what's important, I think, for the cognitive extended cognition theorists is that we don't want to say that everything that we use is somehow a part of your mind, right? So you don't want to say that every tool that you pick up is now a part of your mind. You're using it well, functionally integrated in some sense, sure. But we definitely don't want to lose that boundary between mind and tool. I think that would be a huge bullet to have to bite. Certainly there's going to be things that we do use that aren't just a part of your mind. So that's why those conditions really are so important there. Yes, and I guess all I can say is that I do think that there's going to be cases where it's really hard to tell and it's blurry and it's not obvious. And I think the best thing we can do is to try to look at things like systems theory and try to figure out, well, how do we demarcate between what a system is and what is not a system? And that's part of what extended mind theorists have done, is try to look at some of the work that's been done of how do we, demarcate between boundaries of systems in a way that's not question begging and non-arbitrary. And that's what some of these conditions have tried to do with these conditions.
Thanks.
That's great. Yeah, thanks, Neil. Thanks, Karina, for a terrific talk. Really stimulating. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. Next week, we have Shannon Valor, another philosopher, now at the University of Edinburgh. And she's going to be talking about the digital basanos, AI and the virtue and violence of truth-telling. Looks like it'll be a great talk. Look forward to seeing everybody. Take care. Bye.
Thank you all.